Detective Sarah Parker stood outside the old, crumbling warehouse on the outskirts of town, the early morning mist clinging to the cracked pavement. She could feel the tension building in her chest as she gazed at the scene before her. The body of a young woman had been discovered there only hours earlier, abandoned in the shadows like a forgotten relic. Her name was Rachel Grant, a local university student who had been missing for nearly a week. But what troubled Sarah more than the brutal murder itself was the eerie silence that seemed to surround the case, a silence that grew louder the deeper she delved into the investigation. Rachel had been found lying on the cold concrete floor, her body twisted in a grotesque manner, as if someone had intentionally positioned her for display. Her hands were bound with thick rope, and strange symbols were etched into her skin, traces of what looked like blood and ash. There was something ritualistic about the way she had been left, but it wasn't clear what it all meant yet. As Sarah examined the scene, she couldn't shake the sense that this was no random act of violence. This was something much darker, much deeper than anything she had ever encountered before. The first thing Sarah did was gather the usual evidence, photographs, fingerprints, any physical clues that might help shed light on the crime. But as she looked at the symbols, her gut told her that this wasn't the work of a simple killer. There was something deliberate about it, something planned. And as she began to dig into Rachel's life, her suspicions only grew. Rachel had been a student of anthropology at the local university, her interests piqued by ancient religions and esoteric rituals. But what no one seemed to know was that Rachel had recently become involved in a group, an enigmatic and secretive circle, that no one seemed to know much about. The university had no record of any such group, and Rachel's friends and family seemed oblivious to her new acquaintances. All they knew was that she had been drawn to something that had consumed her in the final days of her life. The investigation led Sarah to a handful of names, other students at the university, some faculty members, and a few people who had connections to the local community. But no matter how many questions she asked, no one seemed willing to talk. It was as if the walls around Rachel's life were impenetrable. Then, one name surfaced, Elias Ward, a professor of philosophy who had become known in certain circles for his cryptic lectures on existentialism and the occult. His reputation was mixed, some saw him as a brilliant, misunderstood scholar, while others labeled him as a madman, a charlatan, or worse. Sarah was skeptical at first, but as she dug deeper, she discovered that Elias had a history that went back decades, a history that was dotted with rumors of strange gatherings and secretive meetings. There were whispers of a cult, a group that had operated under the radar, recruiting vulnerable individuals with promises of knowledge and power. Sarah's stomach churned as she read through the old records. This wasn't just a cult, it was something much older, something with roots that went back to the town's founding. As Sarah made her way to Elias's office, she felt a creeping unease settle over her. The door to his office was unlocked, a faint light seeping through the crack. When she entered, she found him sitting at his desk, staring out of the window. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "I was expecting you," he said, his voice calm and unsettling. Sarah took a moment to collect herself. "Professor Ward, I need to ask you about Rachel Grant. She was one of your students." Elias turned slowly to face her, his dark eyes studying her intently. "Rachel was a very special student," he said, his voice smooth like honey. "She had questions. Questions that many are too afraid to ask." Sarah's skin prickled. "And what kind of questions are those?" He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling together. "The kind of questions that lead one to understand the nature of existence, the truths hidden beneath the surface. You see, detective, people are so caught up in the mundane, in the illusions of their daily lives, that they forget there is more to this world than what they see." Sarah didn't buy his cryptic words, but she didn't show it. "Rachel's dead, Professor. Murdered. And I believe you know more than you're letting on." Elias's smile didn't falter. "Rachel's death was not my doing, detective. But I can tell you this, there are forces in this town, in this world, that are far beyond our understanding. If you continue down this path, you will uncover things you are not prepared for." It was a veiled threat, but Sarah didn't flinch. "What do you mean?" Who's responsible for Rachel's death? Elias stood up, walking slowly toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. You would do well to be careful, detective. There are some questions that should never be asked. There are some doors that should remain closed. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as Elias's words lingered in the air. She had no doubt that he was hiding something, but whether he was a part of Rachel's murder or simply a puppet in a larger scheme remained unclear. She left his office with more questions than answers, her mind racing with the implications of what he had said. The investigation took a dark turn after that. The deeper Sarah dug, the more people started to go silent. Witnesses disappeared. Informants recanted their statements. Her colleagues in the department grew increasingly uncomfortable with the case, urging her to drop it before it spiraled out of control. But Sarah couldn't let it go. The symbols found on Rachel's body, the mysterious cult-like group, the veiled warnings from Elias, they all pointed to something much bigger than a simple murder. Someone was pulling the strings, and they didn't want Sarah getting too close. The pressure on Sarah grew as she continued to push forward. She found herself being followed, her phone lines tapped. Her apartment was broken into, and files were stolen. It was clear that the people behind Rachel's death didn't want the investigation to progress any further. But Sarah was determined. She pressed on even as the threats escalated. Her next breakthrough came when she received a tip-off from an anonymous source. The source claimed to know the identity of the cult members, people who had been operating in the shadows for decades. They were part of a secret society that traced its origins to the early settlers of the town, a group whose rituals and beliefs had been passed down through the generations, hidden from the public eye. And Rachel, it seemed, had stumbled onto something she shouldn't have, something that had cost her life. With this new information, Sarah uncovered a series of old journals, cryptic writings that revealed the true nature of the cult's beliefs. They worshipped an ancient deity, one who demanded blood sacrifices to maintain the balance between the mortal and the divine. And Rachel, with her curiosity and her willingness to question the boundaries of life and death, had become the perfect target. Sarah knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let this go on any longer. The cult was powerful, deeply embedded within the town's elite, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But as Sarah gathered her evidence and prepared to expose the truth, she realized just how far the cult was willing to go. They had eyes everywhere, and they were closing in on her. In a final, desperate attempt to protect herself and bring justice to Rachel, Sarah confronted Elias once again. But this time, the stakes were higher. The cult's influence had spread too far, and they weren't going to let anyone stand in their way. You should have stopped, Detective, Elias said, his voice cold as steel. Now, you're too late. But Sarah wasn't afraid. With the evidence in hand, she was ready to expose the truth, no matter the cost. She had come too far to turn back now. As the investigation reached its climax, Sarah found herself face to face with the very heart of the cult. It was an ancient place, hidden beneath the town's surface, a secret chamber where the rituals took place. And there, in the shadows, she saw them, members of the cult, their faces hidden, their eyes burning with an eerie light. They were preparing for another sacrifice, and Rachel's death had been just the beginning. But Sarah wasn't going to let them succeed. With the evidence in hand, she made one final stand, determined to stop the cult before they could claim another life. The battle was fierce, but in the end, Sarah emerged victorious. The cult was exposed, its members arrested, and the truth finally came to light. Rachel's death had been a tragedy, but it had led to the unmasking of a dark secret that had festered in the town for generations. As the dust settled, Sarah looked back on the case, knowing that the cost had been high. The cult's influence may have been broken, but the scars would remain. The town would never be the same, and neither would she. But at least, for once, the truth had prevailed. And that was the only victory that mattered.